What's up my channel? It's your friendly neighborhood sassy blonde writer coming at you with some writing advice. Today we're going to be talking about how to create a book of poetry, the basics of Poetry 101, and a little peek inside the publishing process. And away we go. Start off by saying that if you want to write a book of poetry, it should be because you want to share your poems with the world. It should not be because you're trying to make a quick buck, because generally you're not going to make a lot of money writing poetry or publishing a poetry book. It's not necessarily a lucrative endeavor, and of course there are outliers that sometimes actually get to do that. Most publishers, however, make them smaller. You will likely not receive an advance, or at least not a very large advance, if they decide to publish your book. And there are also like a lot of rules involved with and a lot of different guidelines and requirements that the presses have for publishing poetry. It's very interesting. Right now we're going to go over the essential steps for wanting to, one, write poetry and then create a book of poetry. Now, first things first, like with anything, you want to make sure you're reading the genre that you're trying to write in. This goes for if you're writing a thriller, this goes for if you're writing a penguin heist novel. Why is that always my go-to? This goes for if you're writing a children's book as well. If you want to publish a book of poetry, you should really read a book of poetry. If the last time you read a poem was in your high school English class, it's time to brush up on the subject. Read some modern poems as well as the classics. This is something I would recommend for anybody who wants to do anything. Make sure you read the classics and the older genres of whatever you're writing, as well as the modern stuff. Emily Dickinson, Maya Angelou, Langston Hughes, and Pablo Neruda are amazing poets, and they are definitely worth studying. But make sure you also look at some of the modern stuff as well. Language changes over time, so do conventions of different genres, and poetry will too. But remember, just because something is new doesn't mean that it's bad. This is a lot in the academic world, where people assume because something is new, it's not worthwhile. And granted, it hasn't necessarily stood the test of time yet, but that doesn't mean it won't, and that doesn't mean it's not worth investigating. So remember, just because something is brand new and isn't considered a classic doesn't mean it's not worth looking into. And remember, you also don't have to like everything that you read just because you had to read it. If you look at things from an analytical standpoint, you can always figure out what you like about something and pinpoint it down to a specific thing. Oh, I don't like so-and-so's poems because they use a lot of metaphors and I might enjoy more imagery in my poems. That's part of what reading like a writer is all about, being able to pick things apart, what you like, what you don't like, and that sort of thing. And you're able to figure out your own style based off of that as well. One of my favorite places to find new poetry is called Button Poetry. I'm going to link to it down below. They put out a lot of books, and they also do a lot of spoken word performances. It's definitely worth looking into if you need a place to start with some modern poetry. The next thing you want to do is know the basics of poetry. I might just do a separate video on that alone. Know the basics of poetry, know the things like figurative language, imagery, metaphor, simile, onomatopoeia, all that sort of thing. Know different rhyme schemes, free verse, word rhythm, that sort of thing whenever you're writing a poem. There's a lot of things to cover with regards to poetry. The next thing you're going to do, because most publishers that do poetry tend to require you to have several of them published in magazines before you can submit your chapbook for publication. So if you want to get a taste for what you're good at, I highly recommend submitting some poems for publication to some magazines. Some publishing firms, like I said before, and I'm going to link to my source down below, require half of the poems in the manuscripts to have been published in magazines and or journals before you can even think about getting the rest of it submitted. I've also found in my research that a lot of firms tend to have contests for submitting your poems for a publication contest, or sometimes they have like video contests as well. I know Button Poetry does that. And magazines as well will have their own set of rules for what they want you to do while you're submitting. Most places you will have to make a Submittable account. That's kind of like the poetry and short story and personal essay version of Query Tracker, where Submittable, that's how you can also do that for any cartoons you draw as well. If you want to submit art to different magazines, highly recommend checking it out. It is also free. We like free. Free is very good. However, on your Submittable account, you will have to make a cover letter. It can just be kind of a generic cover letter. Make sure you include the word count, because if they're looking for something that's going to take up half a page and you don't say that, they're going to be very annoyed. After you do all of that work, so at this point, you've read poetry, you've written poetry, of course, you've submitted some poems to magazines and journals, and you've actually gotten them published. Now you have enough poems collected, then you can begin to assemble your book of poetry. So here are different things that you need to consider. First of all, determine how many poems you need. This is a stylistic choice, and this is a personal choice. Now you can center all of your different poems for your book around a different theme, a central theme. There are many different things that do that. You can kind of figure out how many poems you want. It all kind of depends on how long each of the poems are. For example, if each poem takes up 6 pages, that means if you include 10 of them, you're going to have about 60-page long chapbook or book of poetry. That's another term for it, and that's a very long book. Now, books of poetry tend to be a lot shorter than books of fiction, so that's something you definitely want to keep in mind. Typically, books of poems have one page per poem and are about 25 to 30 pages long. However, there are books that have about 50 pages. So remember, similar to anything else, it's about strength, not length. Don't put your longest poem in there just because you like it. Put your best poems in there. If you're publishing anything and you're putting it out into the world, you want to make sure it's your best stuff. Quality over quantity. 100 pages of garbage is still garbage. It's 100 pages of garbage. Carefully select which poems you want to include. We all went through that angsty teen phase where we felt like we could write poems because nobody understands us, man. Okay, I may or may not be speaking from personal experience. It's fine. But remember, just because you wrote a poem when you were emotional doesn't necessarily mean it's good. You want to have a second set of eyes look at it. You want to have an editor look at it before you send it out for publication, because yeah, it's just always a good idea to have somebody else look at it. It doesn't necessarily have to be an editor either. You don't have to hire a professional. You could just have a friend of yours who enjoys poetry look at it. You want to have somebody who enjoys the genre look at it, because they're going to understand the conventions, and they're generally going to be able to judge what's good and what's not good about a piece in a more objective standpoint. Whereas if you pick somebody who just doesn't like poetry, they're probably not going to like it or be able to give you specific feedback because they have no real frame of reference. And last but certainly not least, you're going to submit your poems for publication using the different firms. Make sure you try to find your own firm that matches you. All of these different poetry firms, they kind of have their own different personality, and they also have their own different set of rules. So make sure you really research that very thoroughly before you start submitting, because from what I can tell, there's a lot of people in publishing who don't necessarily read the guidelines and submit things incorrectly. And you basically you're gonna get free points just for following the directions, so make sure you actually follow the directions. Alright everybody, that's all I got for you today. I hope you enjoyed this writing video on how to create a book of poetry and the different steps of the creating and publishing process for it. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. I post new videos 1 to 2 times a week, and of course, happy writing!